Hello, I'm Jim Tolles. Welcome to tonight's talk. I'll be discussing how to be with awakened energy. As many of you know, I'm a spiritual teacher. I blog regularly at spiritualawakeningprocess.com. There's usually a blog post each week, usually on Monday, that I post there. And then, of course, I do these free talks. I have an ebook, and that's linked down below. And I do one-on-one sessions. So there's a lot of different things that I'm offering as I help people along the path to spiritual freedom, which is ultimately what all this is about. This is what I'm pointing you towards. This is what awakening points us towards. As people are getting logged on, I just encourage everyone who's already here and watching to take a few deep breaths and give yourself a chance to settle in. The more we generally relax, the better we think. I think it's just basic biology that allowing ourselves to settle down changes how we perceive and how we think. As always, the breath is such a beautiful and ever-present doorway into relaxation, allowing yourself to settle down from whatever has been going on in your day, your morning, your evening, your early morning, if you're bold enough to be waking up at this time and you're in the UK or somewhere in Europe. I saw some people signed up from over there. I don't know if they're willing to wake up at this hour to watch this, but if anyone is, thank you. And if anyone would like to say, where you are in the world, I'm here in Nevada in the United States. It's always kind of fun to see who is listening and where you are. And of course, there's no need to do this, but if you want to, you have to be logged in, and then you can type in the little chat pod to say where you are. And that's where we'll have questions. If you have any questions about what I'm talking about, I usually free flow for about 20 to 30 minutes. And then I usually get into people's questions at that point. So you can ask a question anytime, but I usually won't get into it a little bit later. Welcome, Rosanna from Toronto, Canada. Thanks for joining us, James from Florida. So let's get into this topic today. How to be with awakened energy. As anybody who's regularly listened to me knows, I'm very specific when I use that term. And I just offer that as a way to help you be clear about what I am talking about. You don't have to accept my definition, but just understand, where I'm coming from. And also in the terms of spiritual vocabulary, I feel like English is generally lacking. So I think we all need to kind of find more terms to better express all the different ways that we experience the divine. Because it just helps us to understand what we're talking about. Even when we're using the same words, a lot of times we don't have the same meaning attached to those words. So developing our communication, I think, is one of those ongoing challenges of being a human being, and that's why I tend to be so specific. With awakening, I'm talking about an internal system that is moving you towards reunion or realization of union with the divine. And this internal mechanism does itself when it's awakened. It doesn't care about whether you're meditating or not. There's been so many awakened people have come to me, have never meditated a day in their life, and some of them don't even meditate afterwards because they find their own way and different tools to work through. And that can be kind of surprising for a lot of people to find out, wow, this whole meditation thing, may or may not actually matter at all to awakening. Some of it just has to do that we all have our kind of different doorways into ourselves, different avenues that we're willing to take that open us. Personally, I think meditation is a wonderful tool. It does a lot of wonderful things for the brain. We have studies that are showing that to be the truth, not just supposition of spiritual teachers, but there's actual data now around what that does in helping our cognitive abilities and how we feel about ourselves. So in general, I find meditation to be very useful. As I was saying, awakening, this sort of internal turning on of a system that starts to kind of do itself and move you intelligently. Right? It's not confused about what it's doing. We're usually confused about what it's doing, but the system, that energy, is not. My experience is awakened energy, people who've awakened in that way, are very rare. That's not a bad thing. But for those of you who are interested in awakening your energy, I also kind of address that tonight too, to help you appreciate the way you want to build space to kind of prepare for that sort of shift. Another of the many metaphors I use for awakening is like a dam breaking, like water flowing. Like there's this movement that's happening on its own. And if we know that a dam is going to break, we do certain things to prepare to receive. And that often is things like meditation, journaling. It can be things like therapy to work on different traumas and issues that we already know that we have. Because as we clear those away, it makes us more open to what flows and better able to handle the things we don't realize that we're carrying. And there's a lot of inner resistance of all levels. Things that we don't think are problems, things that we've forgotten about, things that got repressed. Just the very idea, like we'll go with this idea of having to prove yourself. Right? This is a very common thing, where a lot of people think they need to prove themselves in jobs and get awards, and even in relationships in certain ways to prove they're good enough for their partner. Right? This can be so deeply accepted as normal that we don't even realize that's a wound to work on. So we want to start out, if we haven't had an awakening and somebody's generally interested in that as a vehicle to help them towards spiritual freedom, that they start doing some of this preparatory work beforehand. I have a link down below in the comment section or the information section around being spiritually ready versus prepared. Because a lot of times people have awakenings and they are not prepared. Some of them have never done anything spiritual in their life, and it can be quite surprising. Life is full of ironies. The one person is striving for freedom, striving to awaken, and then the other person never did a thing in the day in their life, and the one who's never done anything for whatever reason, they apparently, their soul is ready, and they wake up, and the other person apparently not. The more common path that people are going to take is what I call the conscious path. And awakening is part of the conscious path. It's just the inner part of you is moving you towards greater consciousness, greater clarity about what is real, letting go of illusions, letting go of the ego, which ultimately is an illusion. Right, so that's what awakening does naturally on its own. But most of the rest of us will have to choose. And even after awakening, you'll come to times where you have to choose. Kind of that push of that river of energy starts to kind of slow down, starts to ebb a little bit. And then you have to choose again, say, actually, I do want to keep going, keep dissolving, because usually awakening is just the beginning, and it doesn't get rid of all ego, doesn't land us completely free. It just starts to show us what some freedom is. With that said, the conscious path is that constant choosing and how you dedicate yourself, and practice and regularity. All those things become really important, because if the person who hasn't awakened and doesn't have that push behind them, the tendency for all of us is to go back to our ego, is to go back to our familiar patterns, is to justify our familiar patterns and say, well, this is fine, or this is good enough, or whatever justification our ego wants to use. I'll circle back to this topic, for those of you who haven't had an awakening, who are interested in it, this whole preparation and why this is just so fundamental, so important. Because we want to, as best we can, if we're interested in this opening, this amazing power within us, we want to be ready to be able to handle that. In some respects, it's kind of like having a child. Like whenever possible, it's not always this way, but whenever possible, you kind of want to have prepared for that and to be making space for that. Both for mom to go through those transitions of carrying the child for 9 months and to do it in a healthy way and to be nourishing herself and supporting herself so she supports the baby that she's growing. And then afterwards to be able to support a child in this world, right? If we can, and as many of you know, that's not always the case, but when we can and when we actually are pursuing something like this, making space makes these transitions easier. And that's a powerful process for women to be pregnant, to give birth. And of course, for those of us men who care about our partners, and I'm not assuming a same-sex partnership here. It's like it can be any sort of partnership, but anybody who's kind of along for the ride is supporting, right? That's a powerful process for them too. So being able to prepare, to know, and to handle, and to grow as things evolve, because certain things will come up, is important in that much as an awakening. Now, how to be with awakened energy if it's already hit, and perhaps you're one of those people who wasn't pursuing this, or maybe you were and then you just had no idea really what it was, even though you thought you did. And this is a common thing where somebody's like, I thought I knew what awakening was, I read all these books, and then when it came, it was nothing like what I thought it would be. It's like, yeah, because books can't really tell you that. It's like, I can point towards it, but I still can't really tell you about what's that inner intensity. That's why you get all these metaphors. Like, one of the metaphors that people like from me is like my running 3 marathons at once. That's what it felt like my energy did for years. It was like 3 marathons were happening simultaneously inside of me. It was phenomenal, and it was exhausting. And it basically took most of my energy, most of my time every day. That means being with awakened energy really is a lot about making space. Making space in your life for something that will probably not be convenient at all to fall apart. A lot of this really is a falling apart, not a building up. The way that people are taught to hold on to things and try to create things or create new spiritual egos to become someone else. All that gets in the way. And it causes tremendous resistance. It's like being in a river and then holding onto every branch, leaf, rock that you come across and not moving with the flow of it. And a lot of people have these experiences, even when you're on the conscious path, like at different times of feeling like you're kind of two people or you're split between two worlds, and it's very uncomfortable. As I said, this is why whenever possible, I hope people can be prepared ahead of time. I know that's not always going to be the case. But whenever we can be prepared in dealing with some of the inner responses that we're going to have, that's going to help us out tremendously, because the awakened energy is going to move things that it deems you're ready to move into. It's going to show you things that it thinks, and it's making it sound impersonal, like something's being done to you. It's you. This awakened energy is not separate from you, but initially, because we're so identified with the ego, it seems like this other force is doing something to me, rather than it's me kind of emerging, the true me, the true divine self. Emerging and showing how ultimately we are always merged with the divine. Metaphors can really only take us so far. That's another reason why I'll also use the metaphor of dissolving, of being like the ego is like an ice block that's sitting on the water. And the water is divine, right? And all of it's water. So it's all kind of consciousness in that way, if we think of water in this metaphor as consciousness. But us in our ice block form, like we think we're solid and we think we're separate and we think we're different than the ocean. We think we're different than other water molecules, but we don't realize we are. We are just consciousness. So this practice, this awakened energy, starts to dissolve that, starts to dissolve those edges. We start to realize this beautiful world, like we're understanding something that's real. We're not creating a new belief. We're understanding that we really are just one with this. And the superiority or inferiority of the ego, that's getting dissolved. All these old issues are getting dissolved. And part of the dissolving process is this arising of stuff that got stuck inside us. And so if we think of those like particularly like solid, cold little ice cubes inside of us, right? Those old pains, traumas, other issues, right? So as we come into contact with them, those things take a little bit longer to melt. We can kind of feel that discomfort of something cracking and melting and dissolving. As I always say, if you're having lots of physical stuff going on for you, always check with a doctor. Make sure that you're fine. This isn't some neurological thing. But with a true awakening, there isn't anything wrong with your body. You're just going through a powerful transformation. And you're likely also dealing with a lot of your own fear responses. I'm just going to say it again and again. This is why preparation whenever possible is important. Not to just dive headlong into some intense energetic practices, because every now and then somebody's going to dive into Kundalini yoga, some Tantra retreat, some intense breath work, or some other thing that I haven't heard of yet that is designed to awaken energy, and they're going to succeed. but they won't have done the preparation stuff, and they're going to be so freaked out by like how much stuff can pour through them that they can do a lot of damaging things. One of the blog posts earlier this month I wrote was called "What to Do When an Awakening Has Gone Badly," and it's really not the awakening went bad, it's that we responded so poorly that we've hurt ourselves. We've overcompensated with supplements. Like I hear these stories, or we did too much additional energy work to try and balance out the energy work we already did. It's because people don't understand what's arising. They can really do anything. And of course, there's the stories of people who get locked up into a mental institution, which there are many kinds of legitimate mental health issues, but the mind has to also be prepared. So the way the mind can misperceive truth, if it's not prepared for it and to receive it, that's a problem too. So there's a lot of things that can come up because this awakened energy is transmuting all of you. It's transmuting your mind and your heart and your body and your subtle energy. And so to have all of that transformed with little to no preparation is deeply problematic. Since that happens more than a few times, because we never really know when awakening wants to burst, a lot of times we're kind of in this backfill mode of like, okay, so what do I need to address? What can I address? How do I make space? How do I financially make space? Right? This is a very practical thing. And I mentioned in one of my practical strategies, it's another link down below in the information section underneath this video. We have to think about that because money does matter. And we live in a very wealthy nation in the West, in the U.S., or as I do anyway. And a lot of you are living in the West, Canada, right? There's plenty of wealth around us, and we're so blind to it, so used to it, we don't realize how much opportunity we have. But because that opportunity is there, it's important to think about how can we engage with that to financially support ourselves as we go through a multi-year change. That's very common with a true awakening. That's a multi-year thing, and it's not just a blissful thing, right? That's usually just a spiritual opening. Somebody has something, they can be blissful for months actually, and then they return to their normal state. Awakening does not allow you to stay in your habitual ego state. It pushes you through about 15 walls inside you that you didn't know you had. That's a hell of a thing. And still, this is just the beginning, and I'll probably end on that note of appreciating awakening as the beginning of this dissolving because of how deeply we hold on to the ego, and because of our most primal responses, those don't dissolve overnight. The primal fight or flight mechanism. And that's one of the ones that gets triggered a lot and that causes so much trouble when we're not prepared, because the awakening will come and it's usually unknown. So we've got the fear of the unknown, and our fear of the unknown assumes that if we're having these new experiences, whether it's something happening in our head or vibrations or pulsations or pressures or hot, cold, or all these different things that we can experience with awakening, heart palpitations sometimes. As I said, always check with a doctor, but if nothing's fine there, then, there's that, it's the energetic heart that's being shifted. We have all these things going, and it's a lot. We have to find ways to make space, find ways to de-trigger that fear of the unknown, the fight or flight response. And this is why so many of you heard me talk constantly about come back to your breathing. Breathing does so many things to remind us that we're here now, and to calm the body, to tell the body it's all right, let's, and then you're going to breathe for a lot longer than that one breath, right? This coming back again and again, pulling out of the ego mind that's getting scared about something because of a new sensation, pulling back to watch the ego when it's upset when it's coming to a new realization. In the early years of awakening, particularly that first one, it's usually the mind that's getting transformed the most, because this seems to be how it works. And our minds are usually in the way a lot. Not for everyone. Everyone's different, right? We all develop differently. So don't hold on to that as absolute truth the way that is. But it often is in the mind, to open the mind to the reality that we live in. And a lot of times we see a reality that's full of pain. And that can be surprising. Somebody could have thought, well, I had a good life, right? I've got this great family, and I've got this great job, and I'm living in this great place. And then you step out of the illusions you've been perpetuating to yourself, and you're like, wow, my friends are really unkind. My wife and I actually barely talk to each other or understand anything about each other. My kids are brats. My job is a grind, right? All these types of things that suddenly you're forced to look at. And this is still not the time to make changes to all that either. Something that's kind of a near and present danger, or particularly like an overdue decision, a decision you already knew. If you already knew that you wanted to get a divorce before awakening, that will be really present now. But the point in this is not to try and jump to a better life, because that happens commonly too. So being with awakened energy at times, and it's really hard to make a big generalization about it because everyone's different, but at times we have to just simply practice being at peace with this realization of whatever you're discovering, whatever misery you're already in, without trying to change or fix it immediately. Because usually what we're going to do is we're going to try and change it and fix it in a way that we're still comfortable with it. And so by comfortable, I mean that's what our ego is willing to accept and believe is comfortable. So this is the prison cell metaphor I always use, that the ego is still in the prison cell. So it's like, okay, so this part of the prison cell sucks. So maybe if I can move over here to this wall, it'll be better over here. It's like, it's still the same prison cell. Right. And what the awakening does is start to show you the walls, start to push you through those things, these false limitations. That's what the wall is. The wall is a false limitation, a false belief about what you can or can't do, about life, what life is or is not. A lot of realizations come up. This is why you hear me talk about journaling, to just get them out of your head, get them on the page, talk to somebody who won't judge you. And to date, I've never heard of a journal judging somebody. So whether you're writing on your computer, your phone, actually with pen and paper, as I said, I've never heard of any of that ever judging anyone. And that tends to be really important, just somebody's trying to kind of process through what they're discovering and dealing with their own friction. And by friction, I mean that mental ego part that's still saying, well, that can't be right, or I don't want that to be right, or I'm sad that that's right, or I'm scared that that's right. All the different reactions that you're going to have to learn to be with. And that's another big part of how being with awakened energy really is less about the energy at times, is being with your own reaction. These ego reactions, and this is just the start of understanding where they even come from. And all the beliefs, sometimes trauma they're founded on, but it's just sometimes false understandings by family, by society. Like I was saying, the prove yourself thing, or we could pick on the idea that you need to be attractive. All these types of things get taught to us again and again and again, and they're wrong, and they create further false beliefs inside of us, and that's all part of the prison cell. How to be with awakened energy, make space. How to be with awakened energy, be practical about how you're making space. So the financial thing that I mentioned, look and explore your options of how you can find an extended amount of time where you can fall apart and start to figure these things out. Accept that this is not going to be convenient. You're going to have to choose. You have to choose to want to go towards spiritual freedom. And to be clear, spiritual freedom is just this space of what is. It's not an achievement of a bliss state. It's not becoming better than anybody. Actually, it's more like becoming nobody, as I often talk about on my blog, with the latest iteration of that being the path to nowhere. It's another blog post that I put up on spiritualawakeningprocess.com earlier this month. Right, so this whole ego structure doesn't want to be here. It wants the here now to be a certain way, and then it's thinking about what it wants in the future or what it wants to bring from the past. Or it's like whatever your mix of beliefs are is what your ego is doing. It's not really here, which is ironic because all of our thoughts have to come from the present moment, but it's never fully satisfied. And as you pay attention to it, you start to see that dissatisfaction and how it plays out, whether it plays out through laziness or greed or pride, constantly doing things, constantly avoiding doing things. Like everyone's different, and you have to be honest with yourself. And that sort of honesty is part of being with the awakened energy, because the awakened energy is very honest. It's like you just find out, wow, I'm really miserable. And a lot of people do. And as I was using that earlier example, and a lot of times it's people who thought they were happy. And that's really jarring. The easier realizations are the ones that kind of still sync with the prison cell, like what our ego self wants to believe. The harder ones are always outside what we're willing to believe and what we're willing to accept. So what do we have to do? We have to accept reality. And in so doing, we're freeing ourselves and freeing the mind. As the mind becomes more free, it's also natural for us to more freely express and to find all the emotions that have been stored inside of us. As well as, having to learn how to not get stuck in emotions, not wallow in them. Practicing returning to awareness, where just the observer of all of this is a powerful ally throughout all of this. And of course, it's a tool that you use if you haven't had an awakening. It's just that if you haven't had an awakening, just being the observer is a more gentle sloughing away of your attachment to your beliefs. And you start to watch, you get connected, interested, and attached again to your belief. Then you come back, I'm attached, right? And this sort of in and out. During the initial years after awakening, usually you just feel like you're getting kind of thrown out and you're on a horse riding like crazy off into the sunset and you have no idea where you're going. You're going towards spiritual freedom, release of the ego, allowing you to just be, allowing life to just be. And the ego generally doesn't like that because there's a lot of difficult things in life, and that's one of the reasons that it stays around. If just being meant that we were always blissful, everybody'd be on board with that. But just being means learning to be with arthritis, to be with your mother who has cancer, to be with a miscarriage, to be with political upheaval, right? There's all these other types of things that are continue to happen, and we're not going to have any control of them. So we give up the ego inside of us that's saying, I want it to be different. And no, this doesn't mean that we wouldn't be able to take action. I actually addressed this in another recent blog post about how we make decisions from no mind. But that's how the ego will try and convince you to not keep going on the spiritual path. It'll say, well, if you're just here and you have no opinions or beliefs or whatever, then you'll never do anything, you'll never care about anything, and that's just nonsense. It's not true. But it's better to realize that, to come into contact of what it means to take action consciously, intuitively, rather than from the ego. And that's not something that the ego is ever going to understand. And I want to be clear that the ego is not a huge problem to have. It's like wearing a shirt. But our unconscious ego, we've been wearing our whole life, and it stinks. We've never taken it off. We just kind of added more patches to it and more things to it, and then it's just getting heavier and nastier, and we just don't even know how to take it off. So I can put on the spiritual teacher ego, and I can take it off. Right? It doesn't matter. I'm not attached to it. That's a different thing. And this isn't a game that you can play where like the ego's like, well, then if, it's okay that I'm here, then we don't have to go do all this work. It's like, no, because you're still attached. When you're not attached, how you will address kind of creating a conscious ego in terms of like how you work or how you interact with people is so much more organic. If something doesn't feel true, the next day, you don't hold on to it versus our unconscious ego we're holding on to all the time. And it really is like awakening is kind of like peeling this disgusting shirt off of us that we've been wearing. And it's like pulling out hair and skin and stuff. And it really, really hurts because the thing has gotten so ingrained in us. And of course, then we're also holding on. So like we're creating more friction. So we're trying to push back. One thing's trying to pull it off. And it just gets intense at times. It's even intense when you get further along and you are surrendering more. When you've gotten past your first couple of issues, you've let them go and you start to realize, oh my goodness, I feel so much better. Yes to this awakened energy. Okay, I'm on board, right? This happens. But that's an important hump people have to get over. And so how to be with awakened energy is like, understand a hump is coming if you haven't come to one where you've let go of issues, had realizations, accepted them, had heart openings, right? These types of things are certain ways you come over us and that starts to get you more involved, more committed, because you realize that letting go of ego does feel better. It's so much easier to just be rather than to try to be a somebody all the time. And to try and play out all these games to get things and avoid things and protect things and get rid of other things, right? Because this is what the ego is usually doing: avoiding, protecting, trying to acquire something, getting rid of the stuff it doesn't want. It's very consistent. And so to not have to do all that is such a relief. But as we surrender, then we can start to drop into deeper issues. So the initial issues we face at the beginning are not that big. We think they are because it's usually the first time we've seriously crashed into an issue at the heart, mind, body, energy level all at once. As I said, it's why it's nice if somebody's done work and prepared beforehand, because then the mind's more ready for this sort of intensity. And so maybe you're crashing into the mind a little less, but you're still crashing into the body, the heart, and the energy. And all that transforms in its own way. And the deeper we go, the body transforms more slowly. The metaphors I often use is like the mind, changing the mind is like, lighting grass on fire, dry grass, and to boot. It goes quickly. It's not that big of a deal to change ideas. Ironically, we think it is. But once you get into the emotional side of it, that moves more slowly. So that's like a wet log that's been sitting in a swamp, absorbing all that moisture. So you light that on fire, and it's going to smoke, and it's going to take a lot more heat to get that starting to burn. The deeper issues that are living in the gut and then down the hips, now we're starting to get into brick, starting to get into heavy metals, and that needs even more intensity and heat. And usually, the awakened energy doesn't get rid of all of that. Usually the awakening is just opening up space above in the head and the heart. I'm not saying it couldn't. I'm not saying it doesn't touch those things. It does touch those things. But usually so much of us has to be opened on top of that before it can even get there. That sort of work is going to be part of something that happens more in the flow of later on. Of continuing to choose, yes, I want this path, and finding tools at different times, and continuing to listen to the energy, because the energy doesn't really stop. If it stops, we usually had to put a lot of energy to bring it to a halt. And people do. They manage to plateau. You can become more unconscious if you hold on enough and have a miserable couple of years. I talk about this in my 5 common outcomes of awakening video that you can find on my channel after this talk. So understanding when we're being with awakened energy, particularly in the early years, that the awakened energy doesn't stop, and that it's helping us prepare for like the really heavy stuff, like fear of being alone, scarcity fears of not having enough, self-worth issues. Right. While we work on all those issues at the different levels, the mind, the heart, as you kind of get into the gut level of that stuff, you're going to need some heat. You're going to need some intensity, some focus. But if you have had an awakening, you've got that energy still moving through you, and it will help you and support you. And you just keep joining with it. And in this way, you kind of start to move into a more natural oneness with it. That you start to realize you and this energy are the same, as I mentioned earlier, and that you're moving together. And as I said, this is just kind of the beginning. So the awakened energy is getting a lot of us started. Even you can be 70 years old and been a long time spiritual seeker, but when this stuff hits, it still can be just getting started even then. But it's very wise and very smart, because we all have that wisdom inside of like, being able to be here now to realize reality and not ego fantasy. And usually the further you go, the more kinder, more open, gentler, humbler, stronger, clearer of a person you become. I think this is a good place to pause, and so I can answer questions. As I said earlier, you can put your questions in the chat pod. Please keep them directed to me. It's a small area. And, too much crosstalk would kind of hide people's questions, or I might miss them. Thanks to people who've been choosing to become regular donors. I have a $15 a month subscription that I've set up to encourage people to become regular donors, to help me keep the blog going and stuff like that as business costs and costs of living go up. There's a link down below to that. If you've never donated, you can also make a one-time donation, and there's a link to that down below. And as I said, also in the information under this video is a bunch of different blog posts that you can read after this. There's a question from Rafael. Do you know if there's an online group where those who are experiencing awakening meet? As I mentioned earlier, like the way people use awakening is very broadly. So yeah, there's tons of online groups on Facebook and all over the place. But what you're going to find is a whole lot of different experiences. So, I mean, if that's helpful, do it. I'm sure there's more than just the Facebook groups. They're all over the place, people talking about awakening in a whole bunch of different ways. But I encourage you to be curious, ask people questions to really kind of drill into what do they mean by awakening. So you know how you're relating to them and what they're talking about, what it means. In general, I usually encourage people to appreciate and to, what is the point of the spiritual path? To sit with this question. Because what I'm talking about going towards freedom, to fully release the ego and just be. Other people aren't, that's not the goal that they're looking to achieve. Good or bad, a lot of people, what they're really trying to achieve is safety, happiness, or healing. Those are the three others that are very, very common. The problem with safety and happiness is those are feelings, those come and go. And with healing, it's like we can become whole and then we can get hurt again. But the space of isness is always with us. So that's the thing that will watch happiness and safety go, healing and wounding come and go, and all those types of things arise. And allows us to be at peace with it and to handle them mindfully, as well as all the other situations that can come. What other questions do people have tonight? Or this morning, depending on where you are. And thanks for the other people who mentioned where they are. Minnesota, Ontario, Canada. In terms of preparing, if you're interested in the whole awakened energy, it's really all about getting to know yourself beforehand and learning to be introspective and to understand that the way you think and act, that's a whole bunch of choices. The more you can understand that beforehand, the more, an awakened energy will move you towards the truth, and you'll be more surrendered, more at ease with saying, okay, yeah, I realized that what I was holding on to was made up, so I can just trust this thing instead. Trust this energy and the way it moves. And for a lot of people, you're not going to have any sort of awakening ever, and that's fine too. The conscious path is what the awakening is on, but we can choose it too. To say, okay, I want to dissolve my ego, I want to continue to let go and to open myself to reality. And that's generally a gradual process that happens over time, and that's perfectly beautiful. As I said, awakening pushes us towards that path, but eventually it kind of, the floodwaters slow down, and then we have to choose to be on the conscious path if we've had an awakening. From Cecilia, how do I know if I'm working towards dealing the fear of being alone, or if I'm avoiding it by being independent? I feel fearful of not being close to friends, but I tend to do things alone. I think it takes you back to honesty. Are you really avoiding other people, or, does it just feel natural right now to be independent? You're going to find out that, self-honesty is just kind of central to all of this. And the more honest we are, you'll know if, you're trying to avoid others rather than just enjoying being on your own, being independent. Maybe there's some more you can give to me in the chat there to give me specifics, because it's too general of a question, because it can change for the person by the situation. From BV the Sage, I usually host a meditation group on Wednesday nights, but today I felt a strong energy within me and I became intensely present all day. In the evening, no one showed up to my event. Strangely, everyone canceled. Seems like a message or lesson I'm supposed to see. Maybe I was too attached to it and this group of people isn't serving me. Or maybe it just didn't need to be tonight and you needed to take care of yourself. Right? It's very tricky to put meaning on a lot of stuff, because once again that takes us back into that prison cell Or like our ego has certain beliefs that it's used to using to apply to all sorts of situations. That's why so often when we come back to awareness, awareness has no belief, and it's powerful to just let the situation be as it is. If certain patterns show up in life, then, we can investigate. If like people keep not coming up to this meditation group you've been having, then you can ask them, right? And so the sort of directness of engaging with other people is important too, that you'll find the spiritual path makes us very direct. We really don't assume as much about anyone or anybody else's motives. We find ourselves more directly engaging if we have questions or if we have interest in anything, if that comes up. Sometimes we have no interest and we don't care. That happens a lot too. That's another topic I discuss in other blog posts about losing desires, which you can find on spiritualawakeningprocess.com after this too, if you want to. Simply put, I would just be very cautious about creating any sort of meaning out of what other people do. And it really is different to make more space to just be in this space of being without creating meaning. But a lot of things in life don't need us to make opinions, beliefs about them. BV says, makes sense, thanks. You're welcome. For anyone who's just signing on, we're taking questions. And there's going to be a recording of this talk. It'll automatically upload about a half hour after this ends at 7 p.m. Pacific time over here. Letting go of meaning in general is really, really important during those initial years of awakening, because we're usually going to guess wrong. A lot of times we find out what happened kind of figuring out after it's happened. Now, I've had plenty of conversations where somebody's like, well, what do you think it is? I'm like, I don't know yet. Ask me in 3 months. Then I'll probably be able to tell you, because you start to get the clues, after something has happened, like your heart feels really open. It's like, well, it was a heart opening. And you can start to figure out these different little signals that are happening in the body or the mind when something's getting worked on. A lot of times what we're trying to do with the mind too that gets in the way is we're trying to make ourselves feel safe. And that's a response to the other part of the mind that's making us feel unsafe. So we start to set up these opposing egos. This is such an issue. Rather than just come back to awareness, come back again and again, just observe, right? So there's something that's uncomfortable. We don't need to start a fight by making something else say, well, this is the way it's supposed to happen, and then fighting together, and then trying to hold on to this belief in every situation. And we just make it so difficult. So what we're here to do is to drop. Just keep dropping, keep dropping, keep dropping. What other questions do people have? Questions about what to do after awakening, or questions if you are interested in it. So from Rafael, do the realizations you receive keep on evolving? Kind of. I don't know what you mean by evolving, but they definitely kind of deepen. So that we can realize intellectually that we are all one. And that's a certain type of realization. But if you realize it in your heart, that's a different level of realization. If you realize it in your gut, that's another. So definitely as we go further along, you don't get as many novel realizations. Novel meaning new and you haven't heard them before. They just kind of keep sinking deeper into you. Or maybe that's not even the right metaphor. Maybe it's just a sense of more of that inner resistance to them dissolves away. And so you just see them as being more and more real and understanding, oh yeah, that really is how it is. Does that make sense, Rafael? It is kind of funny too, because you'll have the same realization at a deeper level, and you're other people's didn't you say that already? It's yeah, but it's different. You're welcome. I'm glad that makes sense. And as I said, this moving towards freedom is moving us towards being nobody. This space we just are. We don't have to try and be a somebody. We can use things like names, like Jim told us as a name. It's not who I am, and it's useful for people to Google me, to know how to refer to me, right, when we're having a conversation, but it's no more than that. So in an interesting way, we're kind of hollowing these things out. And so much of Western culture, it's all about building a name for ourselves, which is really building an ego. And then once you do that, you have to defend it constantly and protect it from whatever perceived threats to it. And of course, since it's an ego and it doesn't really exist, everything can be threatening to it. So the smart intellectual is always scared of being found out that they're wrong. So it's a question, does the constant returning to awareness eventually create... I think there's another rest of your question, Gabriel. Does it create a change in our default mode? I think this is going to be one of my yes or no sort of questions. Because we're not creating a mode. All right, because a mode is like a new ego position. It's like, this is how I should be. And this is what your deeper insecurities that get revealed as your ego breaks down are trying to avoid. They don't want to be in this sort of openness because it feels vulnerable and it feels like we could be hurt. So it's not really a default mode, but there is a way that we're much more flexible. So continuing with this idea of freedom, that we have the flexibility to meet any situation as is, rather than the inflexibility that the ego provides. So like if you're in a car wreck, right, we need the flexibility to take care of ourselves, make sure we're okay, make sure the other person's okay, go through that sort of ease of being at peace with the situation. What we don't need is the ego to be upset about it and to create more problems. So returning to awareness does allow us to be with those sorts of difficult situations. More or less, we're generally more peaceful and more loving, but I don't want to call it a default mode because we don't have to be that way. So there's just a lot of fluidity. So maybe just thinking more in terms of that sort of fluidity of like being any mode as life, demands of you, because life can demand all sorts of things of you. Does that make sense, Gabriel? There's a question from Roseanne. I feel like as I'm awakening, the less I know. Does that make sense? Yeah, because it's the ego that thinks it knows everything, but usually it ends up being more of a balance. So one of my favorite metaphors for this, and you can do this right now as you're listening to me, is think of having your eyes open versus your eyes closed. When you close your eyes, that's unconsciousness. When your eyes are fully open, that's full consciousness. But when your eyes are fully open, you actually understand something. So you do know some things, but you also don't know others. For instance, as I'm looking at my computer screen and I'm talking to everyone, I can't see behind the computer screen, but I can see the computer. So I know the computer, but I don't know what's behind it. And so I'm humble about appreciating what I don't know, but I'm also kind of in that, there's a strength and humility in knowing what I do know. So that's kind of the pairing. When our eyes are closed, we don't know anything. So that's the ultimate ignorance. And what we do in that position when our eyes are closed, as most people's are, is we guess. And then we try to hold on to our guesses. And our ego, like the intellectual ego I was just mentioning, starts to try and defend it. No, this is the correct guess. And it's always a funny thing to take an intellectual like that and pit them against a spiritual teacher. One whose eyes are closed and one whose eyes are open. And just kind of the general mirth the teacher has with that, because it's like, I'm not going to argue with you, you're making things up, but you're so committed to having your eyes closed and protecting these things that you can't win that argument. Gabriel said yes. Okay, I'm glad my response makes sense. And as I said earlier, there's a bunch of links down below in the info section with a whole bunch more blog posts I've written. I've written over like 800 of them. And my Jim Tolles YouTube channel has like over 100 videos or something on it. So I've talked about a lot of these things. So if there's anything I haven't fully answered, feel free to go rifling through all that stuff. It's all free. From BV, I'm curious about memory loss and awakening. I don't remember a lot of things these days, but I don't mind much. Does it change over time? Does memory get impacted permanently? In a true awakening, no, memory doesn't get impacted permanently. It's just we don't care in the same way that we once did. I had another student who was messaging me about this very thing a while ago. You just don't care because the ego needs to preference a lot of things and to hold on to things that are important to its story, right? So the memories that most of us have for a lot of our life all have to do with the ego trying to reinforce its story with important points. And when I say that doesn't mean you're reinforcing a fun story. We could be reinforcing a very unfun story, like a story of trauma and self-worthlessness. And so those moments where the person feels like they're being treated badly is what the ego remembers. And they don't remember the 19 other times where they were complimented or they're told they looked wonderful or they were really smart or all that stuff because it doesn't fit the ego story. So this is just another reason why, letting go of the ego just makes a lot of sense. It's like, who wants to remember that sort of a story? Now, to be fair, there's a lot of prideful, narcissistic egos who think they're the best thing in the world, and then as that drops away, they're confronted with their narcissism and things like that. The memory seems to be kind of one of those things that gets a little fuzzy for a while. But then, I can remember stuff if I want to. I just often don't choose to hold on to those things anymore because I'm not trying to construct an ego self or to maintain it. So any long-term memory issues, see a doctor. But the initial fuzziness we can have for a while, yeah, I've had that. It comes and goes. It doesn't ultimately inhibit real thinking. And of course, if we're really triggered with fear, like that fuzzes up our heads, so we don't think particularly well if that's happening. Thanks for the question. From Karen, hi Jim, are you able to speak about the physical aspect of awakened energy, in particular energy at the crown? Well, energy can be anywhere in the body. It's just more like, where are you holding on? So if we're holding on or we've got resistance, it's usually some sort of pressure, heat, something's pushing on something. Is there more you want me to say about that, Karen? And when the resistance goes, then the pressure tends to go. It's one of those ways where you can really kind of test, are we dealing with something energetic? Because if we breathe into it, we focus on it, and we give it some more energy. If it's energetic or emotional or whatever is stuck inside, that emotion or stuck memory or whatever it is comes up. We acknowledge it, we feel something, then it releases, and then that space where there was tension or tightness or pressure or whatever it was resolves itself, and we feel more open. Versus if there's something actually physically wrong at a particular point in our body, then it's likely to stay there. And keep in mind when I'm talking about this, I'm not talking about doing any sort of stretching or any sort of thing like that. If stretching resolves something like that, then what we're talking about is some sort of tension somewhere in the body that's being released, some actual tension. Well, that message went through, Gabriel. Raphael's asking, do you also hear a high-pitched sound in the back of your head? Yeah, let's be careful when we start to find all these other different physical experiences. A lot of times these days people are trying to blame everything as spiritual in a sense that any sort of physical thing that can happen is having to do with spiritual energy. And there's a lot of different body things that can happen, and I always encourage people towards appreciating the body. I'm reading this book called The Good Gut by these two wonderful authors. It's a husband and wife, the Sonnenbergs. And they talk about how much our mood and our general disposition, how anxious or depressed we are, is defined by what's going on in our gut. So lately I've been really encouraging people towards better health, better taking care of their gut. The Western sedentary lifestyle is terrible for us, and that will cause all sorts of different physical symptoms. And cleaning out at that level is really important before jumping to any sort of conclusion about any sort of high-pitched sound, pressure, or anything else having to do with awakening, or fatigue for that matter, right? The gut does a lot of stuff with how we feel energetically. So this is just kind of something that I'm going to reinforce more and more in my work, that we need to address the fact that Western sedentary lifestyles are not healthy for us at all in any shape or form. Processed food, for the most part, is not healthy for us. It's not what we're physiologically designed to eat. And we need to address those levels. As we do that, then it actually gets a lot easier to determine if something is of spiritual origin, and do like what I was talking about, breathing into something and helping to resolve it. So we're coming to the last couple of minutes, and I see some more questions. If you haven't asked a question yet, please feel free to do so, or you can message me later on. And also, there are a bunch of links down below, and if you want to support this, and thanks to everyone who are regular donors and part-time donors, I really, really appreciate it. If you want to donate, there are links below to donate a one-time or to become a regular donor. Regular donors, I'm asking for $15 a month. From Cecilia, an example, it seems like people always do things together, like have lunch. Well, I just eat when I feel like it, but then feel a little self-conscious when I'm eating mostly alone. It makes me wonder. Thank you for the example. Going back to your earlier question about, when are you being independent and when are you just fearing people? Well, whenever something is feeling self-conscious, that sounds like fear. I would encourage you to breathe into it and to be introspective. Say, okay, what's feeling self-conscious here? So just being curious about yourself will go a long way in helping you to understand why you're doing this. And of course, however you grew up in childhood, teenager years, can kind of show you, like, this is the template of your ego. This is what your ego learned to do and be, and what was acceptable and what was not acceptable. Gabriel is saying, do deepenings or realizations ever create a permanent facilitation of concentration, meditation, or things of the like? We got to be careful with permanent. Like, I'm hearing this in your questions, Gabriel, this default mode, right? This one way of being, or permanency. Like, nothing is permanent in the human world. So we're going to be really, really careful about that, because the deeper unconscious that you may find inside yourself may not be comfortable with change. And I would encourage you to investigate that, to say, okay, is something inside really afraid of the ever-changing nature of life and of my body? Like, our bodies are constantly changing. Things are dying and being reborn, bacteria inside us, cells inside of us, all sorts of things are going on. So permanency is always going to be a very, very tricky thing. I mean, even this planet isn't permanent. It's just going to outlast us, right? It's already been around here for 4 billion years. It's gone through all sorts of shifts and climate and whatnot. It's going to be here. But eventually something will happen. I think the sun is supposed to go supernova or become red giant in 20 billion, or I don't know what it is. And that will eventually go away. So permanency, we have to be careful, because it doesn't exist, and it's usually a sign that our ego is insecure and scared. And we want to understand the fear and go towards it, because that's how we can dissolve it. From BVM, mostly alone after awakening, much more than before. I wrote a blog post about loneliness, so please search on that after this talk. Karen says, I experience crown activity most of the time. Yes, it's been checked by a doctor and other body energy, but it's far stronger in the evenings. Well, as I said, breathe into it, bring your attention, focus, relax into it, and see what comes up when you bring just sort of gentle awareness to it. I think this is probably the last question here. This is from Gabriel. Just seems like after years I can't get signs of actual progress and wonder if it's even a thing. Oh yeah, it's a thing. So I just would point you back towards that fear, like something that's wanting to get somewhere and wanting to become some sort of stable goal. So that freedom isn't a goal exactly, right? It's just a realization of what is. But the way that we're often looking at it, and we have to be honest, is that we're looking for a safe space where everything is always going to be okay for us. And this is just the honest reality, that this is what most of us are trying to get to, and the gradual understanding that doesn't exist, and moving towards a deeper and truer interest in spiritual freedom usually happens as we recognize that more and more. To say, wow, I'm just still trying to make all of life safe and to get everything I want so I feel good. And that can't be done. because this body and this life is constantly changing. And part of the whole awakening thing is an embrace of change and of reality. And this human reality is constantly changing. I feel like that's a perfect place to end. Once again, I'm Jim Tolles. Thanks everyone for all your questions and for this wonderful dialogue we've had tonight. You can email me other questions if we haven't gotten to them at spiritualawakeningprocess.com. I have a contact form. And yeah, thanks again. And thanks to all those of you who have donated and supported me. It's deeply, deeply appreciated. So until next time, be well, everybody.